Ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, I've often been a guest here. We often had Alexander Kluge here, the great writer, filmmaker, and legal expert. Some of you may recall 2 years ago when he showed us a film, and he, with his white hair and his inner wisdom, 50 years ago, 1975, Edgar Wright, and he made a film on women's fates. The title was In Danger and Greatest Need. Will the middle road cause us to die? And this is the title. And he said in an interview back then that he was in an occupied house in Frankfurt, and he saw this as graffiti on one of the walls. But Alexander Kluge, that this is a sentence that's much older. In danger and greatest need. This goes back to Friedrich Logo during the 30-Year War. That is to say, the largest political and economic and moral destruction in our country. And probably from a time when between the King of Sweden and the Catholic lead, the middle road was dangerous, and you had to take a decision one way or the other, one solution or the other. Well, this is basically saying no to the idea that the solution to a problem is always a compromise for the conflicting situations, a sort of a question of trying to find the best solution. Now, maybe truth is not always in the middle. And why should it always be in the middle? As Copernicus talked about, he replaced a world with not the sun, not the earth, but the sun as the middle of our world. This would not have been possible at that time to see a compromise as a solution. When Kennedy, the U.S. Secretary of Health, when he talks about 100% of scientists are against what he says, then I think we should not try to come up with a compromise there either. And if we talk about climate change, and if you see that this is something is discredited, and the American government says that in all university departments they should also have representatives from the other position, then this is an attack on truth, which I don't think is always seen as the best solution. Or to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, nobody to their own facts. That was a famous senator. But this applies not only to a diagnosis, but also for therapy. In other words, how should the negotiation results look? Monica Schnutz says, if Trump calls for 40% tariffs, that doesn't mean that 20% is automatically the right solution. If he calls for 80%, then that doesn't mean that we would be happy with 40% and able to agree on that. But of course, this doesn't change a thing. And we've talked about that. We also have to have conflicts. You have to weigh the different interests, the values, short and long-term perspectives. We also see that we have to have all of this. And that's why when we talk about this, it's not something that I would say we don't need to come up with radical solutions for everything. It's only if we are in danger and in greatest need, only in existential challenges to individuals or to the community. And to remain pessimistic here, this stresses the fact that a compromise can lead to death, but it doesn't mean that the right or the left-hand solution are perfect. All of them can lead to death as well. The central statement here is the medium way is the way to go, and we all know this from our private lives. If you take the middle road, the middle ground, difficult medical situations are also with political conflicts. We're familiar with a situation that sometimes you decide for radical solutions. But that brings me more to my analysis. There are three different levels that you have to consider. First of all, when is a situation all that dangerous? When are we in a situation of danger and greatest need? So you have to take a radical step where we talk about the different situation. Who defines this? In order to quote Carl Schmitz, who defines an exceptional state? How can we compare all of this? Almost everyone, everything that the American president has done in the last 6 months was on the basis of an emergency situation. Apart from the most recent tax law, nothing went through Congress. Almost nothing went through Congress. Nothing went through the House of Representatives and the Senate. It was always a question of an emergency orders. In other words, that was part of his campaign. If you take a look at the overall situation, and this was seen as a massive illegal criminal invasion of people who are not even afraid of eating their pets. And internally they say that this is a democratic intellectual who is taking over the whole country, then that is an emergency. This is how they are acting. And I think for all of us, nothing is more astonishing in the United States. I was there last year with my wife for several months. You have to say, what is the emergency? This is a perception which was something that you don't get as someone from the outside. It's quite different here. In the most recent contract between the coalition partners here in Germany, they want to live in peace in a period without challenges. This couldn't have been any nicer back in the 1980s, but now you can see that the major economic and society's challenges are not mentioned. What about expenses on climate change? This is an existential threat. What about demographic change? What about the statements we see something about arms investments. We heard about that from Mr. Schulerich. But that means what's astonishing here is that in Germany we tend to confirm normalcy, which does not exist. But in the United States, they seem to be provoking an emergency which isn't even there. Now, the statement that the middle ground leads to death doesn't help us. We're talking here about a helpful, radical solution. What risky therapy will help our patient? What military activities will stop the war? What political reform will bring us forward? And we see competition here, and we see a number of different extremist parties using different prospects in order to get votes, and they have left and right-wing possibilities, and we see that there is no unity there at all, and you have to give the impression or have the impression that they don't even want to go from A to Z and to come up with a good, consistent program. And finally, who is going to decide on the question of use? The doctor and the patient might decide on a radical therapy. In the military field, we heard from someone last night, you might see some commander who, in a certain situation, knows what needs to be done. For anything else, we need a majority in the parliament, and we don't want a dictator, even though if we go back to ancient Rome or other people are thinking about that, where you see emergency situations where 6 months ago a dictator was elected, and then you can also see that after 6 months they can go back and then go back to where he was left. Now, this is not what things look like here. We have to have majorities. You have to convince the public, and it is very difficult to achieve major changes in a democracy. But without a democracy, things won't work either. So that means that when we talk about politics, what we must require of politics, no matter how dramatic a situation is, you have to react appropriately. And in that way, maybe you have to ask for the public to also deal with this. So in a democracy, you also have to have the majority of the citizens and the politicians, and we also have to consider the extent of the risk. You can't just make sayings. If you're involved in policy, you can say, okay, we're a rich country, this is something that will cause failure quite quickly. And even then, it might be too late. We saw a picture of the American Marcana, and it's just the Bank of England, and they wrote a wonderful article saying the tragedy of the time horizons, and he made it very clear that almost always it's the decision for a change is taken at a time which is too late, and that nobody, politicians with their terms of office, CEOs with their contract terms, or the voters who have their prospects. What remains is a message that in a democracy we cannot have discussions, which means that major problems are ignored, and that unusual things, we might even be able to discuss radical solutions so that we don't come into a situation where we talk about political opportunities both in the diagnosis as well as in therapy. Thank you very much.